Hello everyone, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, students, colleagues, distinguished guests, Jamaica Kincaid. Welcome everyone. It gives me enormous pleasure to open this very special gathering in honor of our distinguished guest and this year's much-deserved David Prize Award, Jamaica Kincaid. As I'm sure any lover of English literature or any literature knows, Jamaica Kincaid is an award-winning author of numerous essays, short stories, and novels, which offer evocative portrayals, among other things, of family relationships of her native Antigua, striking for their lyricism, incisive emotional honesty, and a complex artistic exploration of many modes, a mode of autobiography which veils as much as it reveals the many modes and moods and moments in life of the author as charted from her first collection of short stories, At the Bottom of the River, published in 1983, to her more recent novel, See Now Then, which came out in 2013. This isn't, of course, Kincaid's first visit to Tel Aviv. I understand it's your third visit to Tel Aviv and fifth overall in Israel. So, welcome back. And I hope your visit this time around proves just as enjoyable and interesting for you, as I'm sure you note all that has changed and much that hasn't. And we love to welcome you back here. I want to take this opportunity to thank the Literature Department and Professor Iris Milner, its chair, and my colleague, Professor Milet Shamir, for co-organizing and hosting this excellent event, an exciting event, and Smadar Fisher, the director of the Dan David Prize, for helping us to realize it. And most of all, my warmest thanks to our guest, Jamaica Kincaid, for joining us here today to talk about our work. So please join me in welcoming Kincaid, as I also invite Professor Milet Shamir, who will moderate the talk. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? No.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So this isn't on? It is. It should be on.
Yeah, maybe try this.
Is it all right now?
Oh,
yes.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
So Jamaica, as Noam Reisner already mentioned, it is a great honor and privilege to welcome you back to Tel Aviv University. We feel that you're an old friend by now. It's lovely to have you with us again. And I want to begin by congratulating you for receiving the very prestigious Dan David Award. It's an honor well-deserved, another acknowledgement of the high esteem with which your work is held, not just where you live in the United States, but all over the world. And last night you gave a very, to me it was a very powerful and moving speech at the Dan David Award ceremony. And one sentence that you said really stayed with me, and I'm paraphrasing. I hope I'm not paraphrasing it wrongly, but you said something like, I hate the language of English, but it's the only language I have.
Yes.
And of course, to all of you here in the audience who've read Jamaica's work and know something about her life, this sentence doesn't come as complete surprise. You grew up in Antigua in the 1950s and 60s. It was still a British colony.
Yes.
Antigua, the island in the West Indies, was a British colony until 1981, I believe.
Yes.
And so as you were growing up, and the children who were growing up in Antigua with you, really were raised on a language and a culture and a historical narrative that was foreign to them.
Yes.
And that came from a country very far away, England, where they've never been.
That's right.
And this is something that you talk about, I think, very memorably in your early novels, such as Annie John, where the protagonist is a young girl who is punished for defacing the picture of Christopher Columbus in her history book, and her punishment is to copy large sections from Paradise Lost. Or in Lucy, where the heroine talks about the irony of seeing the daffodils, the flowers, for the first time at the age of 19, after she had to memorize this Wordsworth poem about the daffodils when she was 10, but never saw that flower because it doesn't exist in Antigua. So I wanted to maybe begin by asking you, what does it mean to write in a language that you hate and yet is the only language that you have?
Oh, what does it mean? Is that your camera? It's very distracting. Let me see, what does it mean? Well, a lot of things. But let me see if I can start with one. First of all, I want to say that that situation you describe of learning about England would be true for every child in the British Empire, so that, I don't know if you've ever heard of a Calypsonian named the Mighty Sparrow. He would have had the same education, or Wuli Soyinka would have had the same, or someone growing up in what was Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, would have had that education. In many ways, it was a very good education if you were an English child of a certain economic background. It was an education designed by the Foreign Office, and people in that office usually had gone to Eton and a school like that, and then Cambridge and so on. So in a way, you know, we were there, let me see how to put it, we were expressions of their creativity. They didn't know what to do with themselves other than to make us into adherents to English culture, British culture, though we never called it British, we always called it English. We forgot about Scotland and Wales. An interesting thing about our education is that we knew, for instance, I knew a lot about Roman Britain. I just knew a lot about it. Why? I don't know what I would do with it, except in my case, it led me to a love of history and a love of studying how empires behave, or the aspiration to empire. I'm coming back to the language issue. In the language issue, conquered people often develop two personalities. The personality, I think Frantz Fanon called it black skin, white mask, or W.E. Du Bois called it something else. But we developed two Pardon?
Double consciousness.
Double consciousness, that's right. So we develop a way of living and aspiring to be a person in the conquering power, and then we live among ourselves in a culture we are in the middle of creating, either through memory. In your case, you can see it in something like Yiddish, or the culture that came out of the place called the Pale, a kind of no man's land, which was a land for people. Something comes out of it. Human beings always try to make something, always trying to create ourselves. The self we are is sort of a blank to us, and then we make something of it through language, through our imagination. So for me, growing up with this language, English, which I had to speak all the time. There was another language that we were developing called Creole, or broken English, or bad English. Those were the three words for it: broken, bad English, Creole. But I wasn't allowed to speak it in school or in front of my parents or adults, really, though they spoke it all the time too.
Maybe that's one difference between the child growing up in Rhodesia or in other places who received the same kind of education as you did, but possibly had another language in which to live outside of life in the public sphere. I'm thinking maybe of an analogous situation here in Israel. You know, we have the kind of a recent phenomenon, or not so recent anymore, Arab Israeli writers who write in Hebrew. They choose to write in a language of the public sphere, but they always have recourse to Arabic at the same time, from which they can dig up phrases and use it in order to problematize the language of Hebrew. But you didn't have that. You only had English.
That's right. But and to go back, the comparison between Arabs and someone in Rhodesia, a Rhodesian, an African in Rhodesia, would have had a history in the place in which they live. The trouble for the, not trouble, the problem, or whatever you want to call it, for the African in the New World is that they come from different places in Africa, where in Africa they might have been enemies even, don't speak the same language, don't have the same culture. In fact, not only might they have been enemies, they might have sold each other into slavery. That's something that is not much recognized, that perhaps the slave trade in the New World would not have been so successful if Africans hadn't cooperated in it. Of course, they didn't understand the slavery that they were a part of was different from the slavery they had among themselves. In any case, the African in the West Indies, or in the New World, in America even, had to create an identity, a culture. In the American case, they were not only denied language, they were denied, it was illegal for them to know how to read. And so therefore write. You were forbidden. It was against the law. So they did a whole set of creative things that are in some ways unique to them. We in the British Islands, English-owned islands, didn't have that kind of oppression, and so did not develop the kind of cultural infrastructure that African Americans did. And we didn't, not because we couldn't, but it was necessary for us to. But anyway, we have never, in the English-speaking countries, have never claimed a language the way, say, the French-speaking countries. In the French West Indies, the islands there have developed a Creole, which is now recognized as a language, an official language, so that at Derek Walcott's funeral, it was broadcast in both English and Creole. You don't have that in the English-speaking West Indies, in spite of Bob Marley, I would say.
Maybe if we can stay with the islands and Antigua for a few minutes.
Yes.
I'm always struck by the very different and even dichotomous representations of the island that appear in your various works. On the one hand, Antigua is paradise. It's paradise lost. It's this beautiful, natural place that you remember very fondly and with a lot of love. On the other hand, in such books as A Small Place, you seem to be taking a step backwards and to look at it more objectively and to highlight current problems in Antigua, poverty, corruption. So it's a very different island that emerges from that book. And of course, I think we all have kind of an ambivalent relation to the place where we grew up. But in your particular case, it seems to be particularly complex, and also this is a place you come back to again and again and again in your writing.
I'm sorry, I don't know why I'm having this problem with my...
There's some water.
Yes, I'm drinking it. I've never understood why things are one or the other. Everything is both. Sometimes it's 3, 4, 5 different things, all of them true, all of them in contrast, but yet true. I sometimes, when I'm thinking in my head about this, usually it has to do with memory, and I'm reminded that memory is the mother of 9 daughters. I always thought there wasn't some boys in it, but no. And she has 9 daughters, and they were born on 9 different days, so you can imagine They have one thing, a true mother, but they must have different experiences, and they're all true, but they're different. And these 9 daughters are the pillars of mostly of civilization, of most things you consider civilization. And if you look at these pillars, they are very conflicting, very different, but they're all true. So when I speak about Antigua as a paradise, in my mind also is the idea that paradise always inevitably contains hell. So it's not a contradiction. It's I'm always trying to tell something true, but it doesn't mean that the truth. In fact, the truth is the most complicated thing, because a lie is usually like a dead piece of coal. It just flops to the ground. It doesn't move. It has no life in it. But the truth is, it's dynamic. It's complicated. It's all true, but it doesn't lead to one whole mellifluous chorus. It's a very difficult thing, the truth.
And is it that complexity that also leads you to return again and again in your prose?
Yes, to this paradise that contains hell. If you go back to the original story, which I use the creation story a lot in many different ways, because it seems to, we seem to replicate the social part of it in everyday life. The garden story, which is, it's only 3 little lines, but it's so fantastic.
How has Antigua changed over the years? Do you still recognize the same island that you write about when you go back now?
Oh no, I don't recognize it, but I don't. I used to be so critical of it until January 20th. 2017, I realized that, for instance, the book A Small Place, in which I criticize Antiguans and their corrupt government practices, and I would have held up you know, America as not a kleptocracy and not a banana republic and not a this, not a that, and why can't Antiguans be more like civic-minded, like in terms of government, like America, until January 20th, 2017. But now Antiguans can say to me, well, you know, their prime minister is practically a saint compared to the person. Oh, can you please keep him? Yes, but you're used to dealing with people like that. It's very new for us to have an openly stupid person in.
I think we share your kind of new sense of
despair,
superiority vis-a-vis the United States in recent months.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, but you've been living in the United States for very many years.
Very long time, and I feel there again, you know, not ambivalence, but two lanes I travel. I'm an Caribbean American, and I'm an African American. I'm an Antiguan American, but I very much, in some way, take on the narrative of an African American, because mostly that is the way, not mostly, that is the way anyone, I walk out in the street and sees me and will say I'm an African American, and so therefore all the things that I often forget, not often, I completely forget that I look the way I look. Essentially, I think everyone looks like me. And because I grew up in a place where everyone looks like me, and I never quite lost that. So I think, oh, everyone looks like me, and then I notice slight changes, and then I say, oh, they don't look like you. And
that's one difference between your experience and the African American.
That's right. That they are much more aware of it, and I've studied African American history a lot, so that I understand the responses to my appearance to people who are not African American. So I would identify myself as African American when I'm in America. Actually, on the whole, I don't like to identify myself. I've become less and less enchanted with the idea of identity. It seems to cultivating it seems to me to give me a kind of idea about myself that I don't like. Fortunately, any identity I would cultivate about myself doesn't have much power. But if I were to cultivate an identity, or could make an identity for myself of a white American, say, the things I would do would be horrifying. So I don't, I'm not in love with identities anymore.
Why do you say that an identity would not have given you much power?
Well, I'm an African American. Even Africans think African Americans are not to be taken seriously. It's a very strange thing.
I think we need to have this a little bit closer.
I'm sorry. One of the reasons I identify myself as African American is that people who are black from other places, when they go to America, are very condescending to African Americans. They can't understand why they do this or why they do that. And then they soon realize that it doesn't matter where you come from. If you're black, eventually you are going to be shot by the police if the police can shoot you. Ask Armadillo Diallo, who was just standing outside his apartment smoking a cigarette. So, yeah, but I no longer feel, identity is not, though I know it's a very big, and understandably so, a very big idea, a formative idea of Israel. But I'm not so in love with identity for myself. I understand it for other people, but for me, I feel, what is it? Derek says, either I am a country or I am nothing. And I sometimes feel I am nothing. I can live with that. Countries seem to do things that I don't really want to do, so,
Yeah, maybe I can ask you whether that would be true also in terms of your identity as an author, because one of the things that I thought would be interesting to discuss is the fact that you have now been kind of enshrined or canonized as part of that thing we call American literature, right? You came to the United States when you were 16, so you've been there for a few decades now, and you became a writer very quickly and successful very quickly. And I think that now, very often we find your work in literary anthologies that are anthologies of American literature. Your work gets taught in introductions to American literature, such as the one that some of the students sitting here are participating in. And so I was wondering, if we kind of pull that aside from the question of personal identity, but in terms of the identity of your writing, do you feel comfortable being within this category, or are there other categories that you find more appropriate or more descriptive of your work in a better way?
Well, I don't really care what category I'm placed in. If you would like to place me in Israeli literature, I wouldn't mind at all. I'd be very honored. Or Jewish literature, if only because my writing itself and my a great part of my moral world when I'm writing is very much formed by the Bible, albeit the King James Version. It was the book I had to read as a child. I had children's books and so on, but it was the book I read the most, especially what we called the Old Testament. I never much liked the Gospels because they were just full of these personalities. And of course, Paul who had been Saul, was very harsh and unpleasant. But I did like Revelations, which is a very thrilling thing for a child to read. So if you'd like to put me in, I was in Jewish literature because I'm very influenced by the Bible. I was one day the rabbi in our synagogue was reading something, and he said, who would begin a sentence with "and"? Isn't this awesome? This book, the sentence begins with "and." And I said, but I do. I think, and I understand why the Bible has the conjunction in it, or at least I feel I do. There might be other, I'm sure there are other explanations, but I think the conjunction means that there is no beginning, middle, and end. It's all that beautiful phrase, continuity, contiguity. Where is Professor Miron gave me that idea. It will never leave me now. He'll be sorry he spoke to me. The ways in which I will deploy that idea. But yes, as for where to put me in literature, I'm happy to be read in any category, in any language. If it's American literature, Caribbean literature, sometimes I'm in Chinese. It really, these categories seem a part of the marketing department, but not a part of literature. I think.
It's a question of where your book is placed.
Yes, yes, where the publisher will sell more books, so where it fits some curator's idea. But I couldn't. I remember talking to a writer from St. Kitts who had gone to England, and he's in the African American anthology, and he said, "Why am I in the African American anthology?" And I thought, I didn't say that to him, but I thought, you should be glad you're in any anthology. Because, we West Indians don't really read. If I were to depend on an Antiguan audience to read me, I wouldn't be read at all. They hate my books.
Why do they hate your books?
Oh, because I tell them things they wished I wouldn't. They don't like to hear some things about themselves or about myself, or they don't really like it. And I see the influence of a certain book on my writing. A lot of those people in those books, in that book I was reading, the people didn't like them either. My favorite way of speaking about what the life of an author is, not favorite, but it's an example I take great comfort in, is the Apostle Paul was always writing these letters to the various Galatians, the Corinthians, the this, the that, and nobody ever listened to him. None of them ever read the letters to them. But where are those people today? On the other hand, there's that annoying Paul still, and very much read. And so that's my model for a writer. The people you write for won't like you at all, but the people to come might. And it's to come that you want to come, all that is to come. Yeah. And
that brings us to a question that I know you get asked a lot.
Yes.
But if you wouldn't mind talking about it some more, I'd appreciate it. That is the accusation that is often leveled against you, that you write in anger. That is that those readers who sometimes, or in relation to certain books, felt uncomfortable by your writing, said, well, she's an angry writer. This happened, of course, in this small place,
yes,
where it wasn't particularly pleasant for white, affluent tourists who go to places like Antigua in order to have a good time, to see themselves in the mirror of your writing as obnoxious,
Yeah.
self-interested, oblivious people. And so after that essay was published originally in the New Yorker, I know a lot of readers actually accused you of being too angry.
Yes.
And then I thought that this kind of criticism kind of went away until your most recent novel, where you write, we'll come back to it a little bit later, but this is a novel where you write about a couple who are getting a divorce, and it's a bitter divorce, and there are a lot of emotions, harsh emotions expressed in that book. And once again, sure enough, reviewers begin to say it's an angry book, it's acidic, it's bitter. Adjectives that you don't usually, I think, find in relation to male authors who are writing about anger or angry young men or being lauded for being angry and expressing that anger. And then yesterday in the ceremony, we saw a little video of some interviews with you, and you said, "But I'm not an angry writer." So do you think you're being misread as angry? What is anger for you?
Anger is not something that comes into me when I'm writing. I'm usually seeking to portray some version of a truth that I know. But to go back, the anger accusation, I think, started with Annie John, of all things, because she, it's sometimes read as a coming-of-age book, and the little rebellion she shows seems to be disturbing to people. I think that one thing that the American public is not used to is an examination of a black person as an individual, as someone who has private thoughts and is just a private person, who isn't always interacting with the larger historical narrative of being black. The people I write about clearly are black, but I never say so because I don't. No one ever says they're white. They just assume they're white. I assume people are black. There's always a bit of annoyance with me that I didn't write about a certain, my characters didn't experience the world in a certain way. They experienced the sun as hot because the sun can be hot in a place like that. Not that there's a special sun made only for black people. So that, for instance, I don't know if you know the cover of this book. It's worth analyzing. It's a little black girl in a schoolroom, and she's kept. The painting is called "Kept In," and she's obviously been bad. So she's been kept in from recess. You can't hear me. Sometimes you're shaking your head. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. So she's been kept inside because she's bad, and you can see her clothes are torn. She looks dejected. She's sort of a Lucifer, a fallen figure. Outside are her playmates in the sunlight, and they're all in white. They're black too, but they are angelic, and they are in the blessed light. And she's in the dark room with knowledge. There's a map on the wall. She's reflecting. For a long time, I didn't know if the painter was black or white, and I asked someone, and she said the painter would be white because a black painter of that period would not show a black person in disgrace. So you see, there's another way this horrible situation impinges on the individual imagination. Anyway, so the accusation of anger began a little bit with Annie John. With Lucy, it was, well, she was just so angry because why isn't this black young immigrant girl happy to be in, I don't know, and why is she writing about their affairs? That was another thing, as a subtext to it, is that most readers had first of all, I don't say Lucy is black, so the conflict she has regarding the family is not particularly racial. It's not racial at all. It's just this immigrant girl and these well-off people. And the fact that she regards them in such a way as other, most Americans are not used to black people, most white Americans are not used to black people thinking of them as the other. Otherness is a category for the disempowered. The powerful makes an other of the disempowered. What I suspect was new about it was that no one really understood that the disempowered is making an other of the powerful too. These things go both ways. The powerless are not powerless, and they express their powerfulness in ways that we find despicable, and is despicable sometimes, but they're not powerless. The powerless are not powerless. So Lucy was the first book that was judged to be angry. A Small Place was judged to be an angry book because no one from my part of the world had ever said, hey, this is what has happened. Also, I think it was the first book, I don't want to say the first book, it was a book that exposed the thing we now call globalization in its early phase and how brutal it was, globalization. The globalization, the trading of African bodies is the beginning of the thing we call globalization. So there was that. Then, Autobiography of My Mother was judged angry too. I remember someone reviewing it and saying it was the ugliest book in the most beautiful language they'd ever read. And then the last book was just, everyone just said it was so angry. I couldn't see anything angry about it at all. I thought it was, I wasn't really writing about the divorce so much as I was trying to understand the thing we call time. That's the main character in the book, is what is time? You know, I was reading a lot of geology. I was reading a lot of strange things about the Earth. I became very interested in how the Earth was made. You know, so at one point I read somewhere it rained for 100 million years to create the atmosphere we live in. And I went up to a scientist and I said, when they say 100 million years, do they mean 365, 100 million? No answer, because it was such a stupid question, he thought. So I just became interested in in time. What is time? What is I can feel, I can't say for certainty, but I can feel that the thing we call time is completely indifferent to us, and so what do we make of it? How do we you know, divide it and arrange it, and the way we try to capture it, and then, of course, after we are gone, it will be indifferent to our presence, and so on. So that's essentially what I was contemplating as I wrote about this family in New England having a terrible time, and then I would, to counter that, counterpoint that, I would make the family very domestic, but I gave them very unusual names. The son is named Heracles, and the daughter is named Persephone, and they have the traits of those mythical people, and the mother is perhaps a wounded Hera, a permanently wounded Hera. No, I think she's, yeah, she doesn't bring the house down. She doesn't boil the children and feed them to someone. She doesn't do, she's just a very sad, she's a defeated person. As love often defeats women or leaves them feeling shattered. But, and the father is, you know, one of those wounded gods and so on. I was trying to understand a lot of things other than anger. you know. But men write books. I mean, Norman Mailer stabbed his wife because he thought if he didn't, he would get cancer. He actually did eventually get cancer. So stabbing his wife did him no good at all.
Maybe you can stay for a minute with.
Oh, please, please. But does it make? Are you following what I'm saying? Okay, all right.
Part of your interest in time in that book, for me, as I read it, was connected to a certain tradition, particularly in English literature. And that is the modernist tradition. That is, you have a book that is centered around not people exactly, but consciousnesses, particularly of Mrs. Sweet, the mother and wife of the story, but also of Mr. Sweet to some extent. And then your investigation of time has to do also with your investigation of their consciousness of time in an almost, I would say, Proust-like way, or Joycean, or you know, the clearest association for me is Virginia Woolf. And I wanted to know whether that was something that was on your mind as you were thinking about this question of, you know, memories, how alive memories are in our consciousness in the present. What does it mean to learn that things that you went through in your life were actually very different from what you imagined them to be at the time, and discovering later on that whatever you thought about yourself and your family was actually wrong. These kind of questions to me are very modernist.
Oh, really? I didn't know that. But you know, when you think of, as I say, the big influence on me is the Bible. And when you think of it, I often think, oh, it's so modern. It's not an old book at all, because you know, well, just for instance, the creation story. Well, if you the very beginning, the separating of the heavens and earth, and then at the end, God rested. No, I hope I'm not violating people's traditions by. I'm speaking of this as a writer who's read. So forgive me if I'm trampling on something special to you. But it occurred to me, I mean, and I've read it over and over. As I say, I had nothing else to read. Once it occurred to me that the one day was really not one day as we know it at all, but and that mistakes, as Donald Rumsfeld said, were made over that the separation didn't occur in this one day. That must have some days, some attempts, let's say, to make this first separation must not have gone so well. And so, but it would be very much of a modernist thing to just collapse it into one day and move on to the next. But many things must have happened in between, and then the second day, and then all of that is, if you begin to look into it, you see there's something much more interesting going on about time. And modern, it seems very natural to me, regardless of Virginia Woolf and Joyce and so on. I love Virginia Woolf, but I would never have said she was an influence. I would have said my fascination or obsession with how it came to be would have started with the Bible. Would have, yeah. What does it mean? And I actually have now built such. In a lot of my work, recent work, is built into it is lots of analysis or inspiration from just the creation of the Garden of Eden, which, oh, shall I tell you? I mean, just for instance, I became interested in gardening itself, but could see that gardening culture is really as we know, it is really represented in that little creation of Eden. Just for instance, the relationship between the gardener, God, and the garden is as complicated as it is in that book, but also that the arrangement of the trees, the tree of life, the tree of knowledge, which I interpret as the tree of life being agriculture, the tree of knowledge being horticulture, and that it is true that in gardens, the development of gardens, people make gardens after they have a lot to eat, after the life is abundant. Then they begin to make horticulture, begin to arrange a garden in which it is not necessary for life, in physical life, but it becomes necessary for contemplation and therefore wondering, imagining of the world. So I can find, but then the most important revelation to me was the naming of things by Adam, and I can give you a whole interpretation. I've written about it when I write about gardens, but the naming of things which comes about in the Enlightenment, the naming, which is codified by Linnaeus, the binomial system, is a very Adam-like thing. The binomial system gets codified permanently through some plants that came from the New World. And so they had no names. And Linnaeus found them in greenhouse owned by a banker named George Clifford. And he's not just a banker, he's an Anglo-Dutch banker in charge of the Dutch East India Company. So you begin to see, which means he must have been trading in slaves and so on. So you begin to see how the world we live in gets formed, and you can see a line of it in the creation story, the naming of things, the codification of things. And it seems to me that the naming of things is perhaps the most important thing in the history of conquest. That when you name something, you possess it and you empty it of all that it was before. And
Columbus named Antigua.
Columbus named Antigua, the naming of plants, whatever indigenous people, whatever Mexicans called dahlia, you know dahlia? Whatever they called it, it's no longer that. It's called dahlia because it's named after Andreas Dahl, who was a fabulous student of Carolus Linnaeus. Zinnia, almost everything, the naming of the world becomes codified through this system that Linnaeus developed, and he first developed it from things that had no names, according to him. And so you can find that in that creation story, the possession of something comes through naming it. To name is to claim, essentially. Columbus had no way of claiming these islands except to name them. And of course, if you begin to look at the naming of things, what did he named things after things he was familiar with. He was familiar with the landscape of Spain or the landscape of parts of his past, and he named things after them. And in that way, the past of these islands was erased. So St. Kitts is named after St. Christopher because in Columbus's mind, it looked like the narrative of St. Christopher and the child Christ. And so all of this, whatever St. Kitts was before, is not relevant anymore. Very important. To name things is to claim them, is to possess them. And you empty them of everything that they were, and they begin with you.
Of course, you, in your own garden, you don't name, you grow things. And gardening is very important for you.
Yes.
You've written a lot about gardening in the book called My Garden Book, as well as in other places. Again, I'm sorry if I'm attributing an influence to you that is only in my mind and not in yours.
Oh, not at all.
When I was reading my garden book, my thoughts were with Henry David Thoreau.
Oh, yes,
some of the
yes.
chapter headings seem to be mimetic of his chapter headings, like
Yes.
reading. You have a chapter called The Garden in Winter, and he has a chapter called The Ponds in Winter.
Oh.
And in any case, for Thoreau, gardening had a very clear purpose, and this is a quote from Thoreau. He said, he worked in the garden, quote, if only for the sake of tropes and expression, to serve as a parable maker one day.
Amazing.
So he's growing these plants, and he's looking at the roots, but it's the roots of words and of expressions that he's after. How do gardening and writing come together for you? I know that you talked a little bit about the special shape of the garden that you created.
Yes,
the first time
yes.
you tried to create a garden. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
When I was first making a garden, you know, people make a garden and they have a square bed, this and that. I noticed after a while that I was making a garden that looked very much like a map of the Caribbean, you know, a little island here. They were all rounded. They were not squared, and they were isolated, and you had to cross a little patch of grass the way you'd have to cross some water or something. It was totally unconscious, nothing I meant to do at all, and I've left it that way. But it seems to me that and I've accepted it now, that I'm not really making a garden. I'm writing when I'm planting things. I know the history of every plant, where it comes from, what it's like, you know. I've gone looking for plants in Nepal. Plants sometimes I can't grow, but just to see them. Yes, I've become that sort of person. But yeah, the garden for me is it's another form of writing. Well, you have to read about the things. You know, nothing is more pleasurable than reading plant catalogs in winter. In fact, we had such an unusual winter that that I kept making a garden in my head, another garden in my head through catalogs. And so about 2 weeks ago, all the things I ordered came, and I'd completely forgotten that I'd ordered them, and I don't have any place to put them, just plants after plants, because I'd been so desperate to be in the garden, and it was just winter, so I just made up this garden and ordered from it, and that's an extraordinary pleasure, because you read about these things. You read. It led me, the garden, you're mentioning Thoreau, it led me in the garden to read about, to get involved with Thomas Jefferson, and I teach a course on Thomas Jefferson and the African American. And the reason I started, there is a plant named after Thomas Jefferson called Jeffersonia diffila. I think it's diffila, not diphylla. Diphylla would be di, so it's diffila. And it's a plant that has one leaf, but the leaf is divided in two. Each half of the leaf is not identical. Each half is different. So if you put them together, they wouldn't form the perfect leaf. And I thought, how amazing was it that someone named a plant after this person before they knew that this was how he would be described, as a divided person, on even Jeffersonia diphylla. The common name for it is twin leaf. But so I would begin to think about that, and then I would go and read Jefferson's farm and garden book. He kept a record of his farm and his garden. Interesting, this. The garden book has no people in it. It's, I planted this. He would say, I plant peas. Peas were planted on this day. 3, 4, 5 weeks later, peas arrive at table. So there is no person who planted the peas, and believe me, it was not him. And there is no person who reaped the peas, cooked them, and brought them to table. There is no person in the garden book. In the farm book is a list of all the people he owned and what they wore, how much food they needed in a year, new blankets, new shoes, all the names of the people. I always thought that was an incredible thing, that he kept the garden free of the sin that he was committing. It's purged of that. So I then, from that, began to read a lot of him. His autobiography, which is only 100 pages long, imagine that. You know, so yes, the garden for me is a form of reading and writing. I do my own writing in it, and I do other kinds of writing. And reading, I come across something and I start to investigate, which is how I come to know a lot about Carolus Linnaeus. And the other thing, you know, about being in the garden is that I'm not afraid to get involved in things that will be of no use to me, really. I read a lot of things. I for instance, can give you a satisfying lecture on the history of Mount Everest, climbing in Mount Everest, which came out of the garden. I became interested in a famous plant hunter who had tried to climb Mount Everest many times and failed. And then he wrote a book about his flower collecting. And so through him, I became interested in mountaineering literature. I never want to climb a mountain. I just like to read about people who have. But you know, I will never do anything with all this mountaineering reading I've done, and you know, but strangely it is connected to something I'm interested in, which is conquest. Yeah, I'm very interested in conquest.
Not all information is useful information, and as you say about Jefferson, there is the farm, right, the utilitarian space where things get produced and people are listed as objects, and then there is the garden, which can be
his retreat.
From that,
yes,
as you said, a space for contemplation.
Yes.
Thinking about gardening as writing, which is kind of a spatial rather than a linear or chronological way of thinking about writing, brings me to ask you about a very distinctive feature of your writing style. And maybe the best way for me to ask that question is to ask you, if you don't mind, to read the first quite long sentence of your book, Mr. Potter.
Oh.
This is your book about your biological father, your moving book. It begins, by the way, with the word and I believe.
Yes,
so
it does.
It harks back to your comments from before. And the first sentence is pretty much the first page of the book.
I should tell you that I'm also criticized. Anger and her long sentences is...
You're in very good company with long sentences.
I would... well, I've noticed that people have started to write long sentences. And that day, the sun was in its usual place, up above and in the middle of the sky, and it shone in its usual way so harshly bright, making even the shadows pale, making even the shadows seek shelter. That day the sun was in its usual place, up above and in the middle of the sky, but Mr. Potter did not note this, so accustomed was he to this, the sun in its usual place, up above and in the middle of the sky. If the sun had not been in its usual place, that would have made a great big change in Mr. Potter's day. It would have meant rain, however briefly such a thing, rain might fall, but it would have changed Mr. Potter's day. So used was he to the sun in its usual place, way up above and in the middle of the sky. Mr. Potter breathed in his normal way. His heart was beating in its normal way up and down underneath the covering of his black skin, up and down underneath his white knitted cotton vest next to his very black skin, up and down underneath his plainly woven white cotton shirt that was on top of the knitted cotton vest which lay next to his skin. So his heart breathed in its normal way. And he put on his trousers, and in the pocket of his trousers, he placed a white handkerchief, and all this was as normal as the way his heart beat. All this, his putting on his clothes, is in just that way, as normal as the way his heart beat, the heart beating normally, and the clothes reassuring to Mr. Potter and to things beyond Mr. Potter, things that did not know they needed such reassurance.
To be fair, this is not all one sentence. So
it's a pretty long sentence, but
yes.
not all of it. Yes,
it's long and it goes in circles, repetition.
Does it remind you of anything?
I'm going to say the Bible again?
Yes.
Yes, you are. Okay.
And I wasn't thinking. I wasn't thinking about the Bible at all. I'm never thinking about any other writing when I'm writing. But it turns out that influence the Bible and the other thing. Perhaps three things are the biggest influence. The Bible. My mother gave me, for my 7th birthday, a concise Oxford dictionary. It was the most concise of concise. And I read it. And I think that would account for my repetition of words and using the same words to mean something else within the same sentence. I would say that the dictionary would be that. And of course, Paradise Lost, which, as you can imagine, I identified with that fallen angel, Lucifer. And the name Lucy in Lucifer comes from that. Is this, if you would like to leave, don't hesitate. I don't blame you. So, yes, that long sentence.
Yeah, to me, it's almost like incantation, these repetitions. I didn't think of the Bible. I thought of something that comes out of the realm of ritual and kind of ritualistic repetition of the same words again and again.
Yes.
Which do accumulate more and more meanings the more you repeat them.
Yes.
But it's a very distinctive style, and I think the same style is also very evident in See Now Then, which I would also like you to read a little bit from in a second. But let me just ask you perhaps one last question before I ask you to read from your most recent novel, and that is to go back to the topic of readership.
Yes.
Your book, My Brother,
yes.
Which I find to be perhaps your most moving book to me, which narrates the story of your brother's death from AIDS. The entire book really is a kind of an elegy for your brother. But it ends with an elegy to another person, and
yes.
to William Shawn, the legendary editor of The New Yorker. And you say about him that he was your perfect reader.
Yes.
And now that he's gone, you no longer have that perfect reader. So I wanted to ask, did you find another reader? Are you still writing for him? Yes, you are?
Yes, yes. I still wish somewhere he reads it. Yes, yes. He was not just my perfect reader. We were the last group of writers, young writers, that he nurtured, I think is a good word for it. And we would write something and send it to him and just sit in our offices waiting for the phone to ring. And sometimes it would and sometimes it wouldn't. And if it didn't, you never heard about the piece again, and you never brought it up. But if he liked it, he would ring you up or might even come down to your office and tell you how great it is. And he would make you think you were the best. Every writer thought they were the best of all the writers. And we didn't mind that he was not telling us the truth. It was just wonderful.
It's like a parent who tells every child, "You are my
I love
favorite."
you. Yes, yes, yes. It was quite something.
So it's not hard for you to have to write for a person who
is
was in
not
a position
there.
of authority
Yes.
to you.
It wasn't so much authority, but love. He loved us, and it was you just knew. It was strange to be loved. Not strange. It was exceptionally joy or something to be loved in that way for your writing. He made you feel that your writing was as important as your breathing. You know, are you breathing? Are you writing? And, you know, he would read George Tro's plays. He was never going to publish George's plays, but he would read them. And you just wrote everything for him. You know, he would say to George, "Anything new, Mr. Tro?" It was wonderful. It was like, what was it like? Oh, I used to say it was like being a child and you went, who was very well off, and you went to dinner and would say, "Caviar again?" It was wonderful. Yeah.
Well, Jamaica, can I ask you to read a little bit more from your novel?
Yes. What would you like? Do you have a...
Did you have a passage that you wanted to
I like to read about the children waiting for their mother to pick them up. Let me see if oh yes, I can find it. It's very quick. It won't take long. But if you find you might want to laugh, please do. People sometimes laugh when I read this. So the children are waiting for their mother to pick them up from the bus stop. That afternoon, at exactly 4:45, the beautiful Persephone and the young Heracles got off the school bus and found that their mother, the dear Mrs. Sweet, was not waiting to pick them up. They saw the school bus, driven by the madly named Mr. Strange, disappear around the corner below the Bennington Monument. They saw their companions, some wayward boys and girls who lived in villages that were surrounded by evergreens of every kind, except for broadleaf, and the evergreens were all sick with a blight of rust. And these companions were very bad, for sometimes the boys among them pummeled the young Heracles almost to death, and the discipline he required to restrain himself from gathering them up all together in his large brown hands and making them as lifeless as his old socks was greater than the force he had used to smite the entire city of Thebes, as it appeared in his handheld Nintendo game. Those boys in any case had names of no distinguished origin, their names being Tad, Ted, Tim, and such. But the bus stop was empty of Mrs. Sweet, and the young Heracles was beside himself with anxiety and sorrow, for he loved his mother so, and only so. And a dark cloud full of a toxic fire emerged from his forehead, and he directed it toward the top of the Bennington Monument, a structure that was dedicated to a battle that led to a defeat and a triumph, and the defeated and the triumphant were now settled into the normal disfigurement of everyday living. And he caused it to fall to the ground, just missing a bus full of citizens from Germany who were taking a tour of New England just then. So beside himself was Heracles with anger and grief over Mrs. Sweet not being there to greet him when the school bus arrived at the bus stop, that he sank to the ground, drew his feet up into his chest, his chin resting on his knees, so that he looked like an illustration of a fully developed child intact in his mother's womb, an illustration commonly found on the walls of a doctor's office. "Oh, come on!" And that was the voice of the beautiful Persephone, his sister, and that is as it should be, for it was spring, and she was released from living in the depths of the pocket of Mr. Sweet's old Brooks Brothers tweed jacket. Not knowing what else to do, she lifted him up with much ease as if he were some just harvested asparagus, or a pint of strawberries, or a plate of peas, or as if she were removing the hamster that had died overnight in its cage. And she placed him in the right-hand pocket of her own jacket, which was made from polyethylene terephthalate, and the pocket itself was lined with rayon. "Now," she said, as she stroked the curve of his back with her thumb, her forefingers shielding his head, which rested against his knees. "It is very bad that she's not here to meet us once again when we get off the bus from school. Where the hell could she be? What the hell could she be doing? Oh, she just sits in that room writing about her goddamn mother, as if people had never had a mother who wanted to kill them before they were born in the history of the world. And the stupid father named Mr. Potter, who couldn't even read, and the fucking stupid little island in which she was born, full of stupid people whom history would be happy to forget. But she has to keep reminding everybody about that place and those people, and no one cares, and she can't stand it. And where is she? She's in that little room off the kitchen, and from that room she can see the kitchen, and she's making us whatever we all want to eat, and none of us want the same thing. And how she manages to keep writing that shit. Make her stop. Make her stop before I kill her. And it was so much better when she would only knit us stockings that were too big before they were washed, and then were too small after they were washed, and they just gathered dust in the wash basket because she couldn't bear to throw them out after all the time she had spent knitting them, and the hats never kept us warm. They fell into our eyes when we were skiing, and I almost killed myself coming down that Black Diamond wearing the stupid hat she had stayed up making for me as a present. And it is the stupid writing, it is the stupid writing, it is the stupid writing that's keeping her from being on time to meet the school bus that was driven by Mr. Strange. Ralph is his name, too, and that is not a name with a distinguished lineage. And a man, you know, who should be locked up in a jail in a cell that is buried underground, could come and pick us up and take us to his house and murder us or violate us sexually, and we would never be seen again or heard of again, not even be mentioned on the nightly news, vanish from the face of the earth like a species from a geological era that hasn't even yet been detected. What is she doing? What is she doing? What the hell is she doing? She's sitting there in that room at the big desk that Donald made for her, and she's thinking of a sentence, and the way to end it: my mother would kill me if she got the chance. I would kill my mother if I had the courage. And as if such a thing were possible. She lives in that world of the room, with the desk and the kitchen just beyond, and she leaves us here all a man for a man to murder us, for tourists from Germany to stare at us, for all the other children and their mothers to see that she doesn't love us. She only loves the world that she carries around in her head, a torrent of lies, all in her head. We are nothing to her, nothing, only those words in her head. And now look, the night is coming. The ink black night is going to swallow us up, and we will never be found, for we will be lost in the night itself, as if it were the ink black sea.
Thank you so much. I'll never be late picking up my kids again. We have a little bit of time left, so if you don't mind, I'd like to open this up.
I don't mind at all.
Some other people have some questions.
What was the name of the book?
This one? See Now Then.
See Now and Then?
Not and, just see now then. 3 words. Can you please stand so people can hear?
She mentioned the importance of being nurtured in that group of small writers.
The importance of
Being nurtured in that small group of writers at the New Yorker, and having an editor who was supportive. I'm just wondering now that there's now with the proliferation of MFA programs and the MFA versus New York debate, I'm wondering what's your take on that now? Maybe that's something that's a model that's similar maybe to what you sort of went through workshops on, or just go out and live life and so on and so forth.
Yeah, well, the professionalization of writing is really interesting, and I don't want to say anything against it, but I teach. So, but if they told me I couldn't teach it anymore, I wouldn't mind at all. I couldn't teach creative writing anymore. I don't really believe in it. I think that I don't think there is any model for writing. I mean, there will be a theory about the novel is this and that, but the novel is whatever you say it is, that every work has its own laws that applies to it, and it doesn't. Madame Bovary doesn't apply to A.B. Shaw. It's his work has its own dynamics, its own laws that tell you what it is. It's not applicable, but creative writing program tends to do that. You know, I think the short story is Alice Munro, maybe John Cheever. There's a William Trevor, perhaps. And the novel is this or that, which is, you know, I suspect a lot of these people will not have a long career as a writer. Writing, it's not really a profession. For one thing, anybody can do it, and everybody does do it, including me. I don't see how, it's not like being a doctor, or you don't have to be trained to do it, but you have to have something to do it, but I don't know what it is exactly. But the only reason to go to an MFA is because it will give you some chance to write, but then you'll have these idiots telling you what a sentence is. You know, people who, oh, don't get me. And, if you must go to an MFA, go. I wouldn't deter you from it. But the best training for a writer, it seems to me, is to read obsessively. Just read. Some people read obsessively and are not writers, but if you're going to be a writer, it seems to me that it would be better. You know, go out and work on a steamer or scrub floors, and then write. But yeah, you'll just be with people who feel entitled to something. And writers also, yeah, being with a group of people, they'll be jealous of you. Don't do it. Yes, don't let her dominate the conversation. Isn't there anything else you want to know? Wait, is there anybody else? No? Well, she's going to ask another question. Oh, yes. Yes, please stand up.
I want to know the process of writing, how you formulate the idea of what comes to your head when you first write. I don't write, but I would like to, and I don't know how to go through the process. So from the idea that you have to really write, and how do you go on your day when you write?
Do I go to, oh, I'm always in bed. If I'm alone, I eat in bed, I sleep in bed. Process of, I don't have any, each book I've written has had its own laws of what it needed to get to it. I'm very undisciplined. The truth is I'd rather be reading than writing. So I basically write to support reading because I have to have some money to read. But I don't have any advice in that. In any case, it would only apply to me. You'll have to find your own way. You could go out into the desert and eat locusts. No, locusts. Locusts are kosher. But I don't have a way. I don't. Yes. This is my translator, so you have to take everything. One of my translators, another one here. Yes. Yes, he was my first. But so just to tell you, take everything she says with a grain of salt.
Yes, because I have one question. Sorry?
Speak up more.
Okay. I have one question for you. I don't know, because I haven't read anything about it, and I don't know if you want to speak about it, because I see that you rather not analyze your work, and I'm not going to talk about The Small Place, but I was wondering about motherhood in your writings, because you usually, and all throughout your career, you were talking from the perspective of the daughter.
The daughter.
And in your latest novel, the one we heard from, we heard you read from,
it's not the mother who is talking, but it's an omnipotent voice, but the children here, in this paragraph, throughout the story, you hear the mother, and you not hear the mother, but you understand the mother, and you understand the children as well. So they infiltrated into the novel in another way that it wasn't familiar to me as a reader before that. And I was wondering if you can stress a bit about what is motherhood, what the relationship between a mother and a child for you, or for you as a novelist.
Oh, I don't know if I. For me, when I was writing Annie John, the last chapter, the middle of writing it, I was pregnant with my daughter Annie, and I almost couldn't finish it because I was so tired of the voice of the complaining, whiny girl called Annie John. I just couldn't see her point of view quite clearly. I was very glad to be done with it. But about motherhood, my own, I think I try not to replicate my own childhood, but which only means I've done some other thing that was horrible, but I didn't know it was horrible. So I don't know what to say about motherhood except what Donald Winnicott said, a good enough mother. A good.
How did it come about in your latest novel? How did it feels like you're more willing to enter other voices
Oh, I see. Well, the mother-daughter complex, if you want, or relationship, it has, even though it seems to echo my own life autobiography, the larger theme I was thinking about was the relationship between the colony and the mother country. It occurs to me that the social relations in colonies very much mirror and are modeled on the relationship between the colonial power and the colonies. So that children are much brutalized, but it's because their parents are brutalized by the system and a system of colonization. And they exert an enormous amount of power over their children. The control over their children is so unnecessary and so useless, really, but they are mirroring another powerful example, and oh, that's not my telephone. It seems to me that I was trying to say that I sometimes I'm too oblique, but I don't often like, it's funny to be called angry, because when you're angry you speak directly, but I like sometimes to be oblique, and sometimes I'm too oblique. But those mother-daughter stories have a much larger context, larger meaning, not to analyze my own work, which doesn't interest me at all, and which I never read unless I'm asked to. Having written it, it's just unbearable to read it. But yeah, so that's what I would say. But a good enough mother is, yes, I was very comforted by that.
Jamaica Kincaid, thank you so much for